The Bible you've been taught to revere as divinely inspired contains stories that were systematically borrowed from older pagan myths. This isn't speculation, it's documented evidence that religious institutions rarely acknowledge. The sacred narratives forming the foundation of Western faith were meticulously assembled from pre-existing storylines that predate biblical text by centuries, possibly even millennia. In this video, we expose the hidden origins of one of the Bible's most celebrated narratives, the rivalry and reconciliation of Jacob and Esau. This cornerstone tale of deception, exile, and forgiveness wasn't created in a vacuum. Critical scholars have uncovered overwhelming evidence that biblical writers drew extensively from mythological patterns spanning from Mesopotamia to Greece, from Egypt to Japan. Cultural borrowing on a scale that transforms our understanding of Scripture. What I'm about to reveal will forever change how you view biblical originality. Once you see these undeniable parallels, you can never unsee them. Theological institutions have consistently downplayed this evidence for generations because it fundamentally challenges traditional views of divine inspiration. By the end of this video, you'll face the shocking question scholars have been grappling with for decades. Were the Bible's most beloved stories divinely revealed, or masterfully adapted from the mythologies of Israel's neighbors? Genesis tells us of twin brothers born to Isaac and Rebekah, Esau the hunter, firstborn and hairy, and Jacob the smooth-skinned, tent-dwelling younger brother. Their rivalry begins in the womb itself, with the brothers struggling against each other before birth, a premonition of conflicts to come. The climax of their hostility arrives when Jacob, encouraged by his mother, disguises himself as Esau to deceive their blind father Isaac and steal Esau's blessing. Fearing his brother's murderous rage, Jacob flees for his life. Years later, in Genesis 33, they finally reunite in a tense but ultimately moving reconciliation. Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. Jacob bows 7 times before his brother, insisting Esau accept his lavish gift of livestock as reparation. Jacob even tells Esau, "Truly, to see your face is like seeing the face of God," a remarkable statement equating his brother with the divine. This powerful narrative of fraternal conflict resolved through emotional reconciliation, symbolic gift-giving, and ritual peacemaking appears unique at first glance. But as we're about to discover, each of these elements appears in mythic traditions that predate the Bible by centuries. Nearly 1,000 years before the earliest versions of Genesis were even written, Mesopotamian scribes were recording the Epic of Gilgamesh on clay tablets. Here we find the wild man Enkidu, created specifically to challenge the mighty king Gilgamesh, a divine counterbalance to limit his overweening power. The parallels to Jacob and Esau begin in their very origins. Enkidu fashioned as a wild, hairy man of nature, like Esau, to challenge the civilized urban ruler, like Jacob. These two first engage in fierce combat, wrestling for dominance just as the biblical twins struggled in the womb. The Gilgamesh text describes how they wrestled fiercely, a contest of strength mirroring Jacob's own wrestling match. After their brutal contest, the text tells us something remarkable happens. Gilgamesh, impressed by Enkidu's strength, finds his anger abated. Recognition and respect bloom between them. Their hostility transforms into profound friendship. But the most striking parallel comes next. Gilgamesh's mother, Ninsun, formally adopts Enkidu as her own son in a sacred ceremony, placing an amulet around his neck. The text explicitly declares now Gilgamesh and Enkidu are truly brothers. Former adversaries become kin through ritual. What began as combat is sanctified as brotherhood. Scholar Esther Hamori has documented these parallels in striking detail. In Genesis, Jacob wrestles through the night with a divine being at the Jabbok River. Immediately afterward, he meets Esau and declares, "Seeing your face is like seeing the face of God," a deliberate echo connecting his divine wrestling match to the reconciliation with his brother. This is no coincidence. In both stories, a nocturnal struggle precedes fraternal reconciliation at daybreak. Both feature the transformation of combat into kinship. Both emphasize the sacred recognition that formerly hostile figures now see divinity in each other. The Gilgamesh text describes their friendship as two as one, a complete dissolution of previous hostility. When Enkidu eventually dies, Gilgamesh's grief is so extravagant that he wanders the wilderness in animal skins, a man undone by the loss of his brother. This raises questions that religious traditions have largely avoided. Did biblical authors deliberately model Jacob and Esau on Gilgamesh and Enkidu? The evidence seems overwhelming. Mesopotamian myths weren't obscure text. They were the literary classics of their day, widely circulating through the ancient Near East. The Jacob story emerges centuries after Gilgamesh tablets were already copied and distributed across the ancient region that would later produce the Bible. While Mesopotamian, Greek, and Egyptian parallels reveal the narrative templates for biblical stories, the Hittite Empire provided something even more fundamental: the very legal structure underlying biblical covenants. The Hittites were masters of international diplomacy, creating the world's first standardized treaty format. These legal documents followed a rigid structure: historical prologue, stipulations, divine witnesses, blessings for compliance, and curses for violation. This precise format appears virtually unchanged in biblical covenants, most notably in Deuteronomy and Joshua, but its influence extends throughout biblical literature. The Jacob story contains not one but two distinct covenant scenes that reveal this Hittite influence. In Genesis 31, Jacob and his father-in-law Laban establish a formal boundary treaty that follows the Hittite pattern precisely. They recount their history, set terms: "You shall not cross this heat to harm me," call on gods as witnesses, and share a covenant meal. This is pure Hittite diplomatic practice translated into biblical setting. What makes the biblical borrowing so sophisticated is how it juxtaposes this formal treaty pattern with the emotional reconciliation between Jacob and Esau. The Bible presents us with two contrasting models of conflict resolution, one following the rigid Hittite legal form, the other emphasizing emotional catharsis and forgiveness. Even in Hittite mythology, we find echoes of biblical patterns. The storm god's conflict with the dragon Iliad features a peacemaking feast, though here cynically subverted when the storm god uses the banquet to ambush his enemy. The biblical writers were clearly familiar with this motif, but transformed it into something more ethically elevated in the Jacob-Esau reconciliation. Biblical scholars have conclusively demonstrated that Hittite treaty formats directly shape biblical covenant language. The evidence? Undeniable. Identical structural elements, parallel phrasing, and matching ritual components. Georges Mendenhall and Klaus Baltzer's groundbreaking research established decades ago that biblical covenant forms were directly modeled on these Hittite legal precedents. The timing is perfect. Hittite treaties circulated through the Near East during the very period when biblical texts were being formulated. What's remarkable is how biblical writers adapted these formal diplomatic structures into a theological framework while simultaneously developing emotional reconciliation narratives that transcended the merely legal. The Hittite influence wasn't limited just to Jacob's story. The entire biblical covenant concept, the foundation of Israelite religion, was structured on this diplomatic framework. When the Bible portrays God making covenants with humanity, the language and format are unmistakably derived from Hittite royal treaties between suzerains and vassals. The implications are profound. The biblical writers weren't just borrowing narrative elements, they were adopting the fundamental legal and diplomatic frameworks of their neighbors to express their own theological vision. The genius of biblical composition lies not in inventing new forms, but in adapting existing ones to create something spiritually transformative. The biblical borrowing extends far beyond Mesopotamia. Bruce Louden's groundbreaking comparative analysis has systematically documented how the Jacob-Esau reconciliation mirrors multiple scenes from Homer's epics, works written centuries before the biblical narrative reached its final form. In the Iliad, the quarrel between Achilles and Agamemnon drives the entire epic. After Agamemnon seizes Achilles' captive, Briseis, a grave insult to honor, Achilles withdraws from battle, nearly destroying the Greek army. The reconciliation scene precisely mirrors Jacob's approach to Esau. Agamemnon, the wrongdoer, publicly apologizes and offers extravagant treasures, gold, horses, and the return of Briseis, untouched, to appease Achilles' wounded honor. Just as Jacob approaches Esau with elaborate gifts and humility, Agamemnon offers wealth and deference. Both scenes unfold in a ritualized setting. Jacob's carefully choreographed approach with bowing 7 times, Agamemnon's formal ceremony before the assembled Greek army. In both cases, gift-giving and oath-swearing, Agamemnon invoking the gods as witnesses, cement the reconciliation. Even more striking is Achilles' emotional reconciliation with King Priam. After killing Priam's son Hector and initially refusing to return the body, Achilles undergoes a profound transformation when the elderly king enters his camp in secret. The scene unfolds with shocking similarities to Jacob and Esau's reunion. Priam humbles himself before the man who killed his son, embracing Achilles' knees and appealing to memories of Achilles' own father. Moved to compassion, Achilles weeps with Priam until the house was filled with the sound of weeping, exactly mirroring how Jacob and Esau fell on each other's necks and wept. In both narratives, the formerly hostile parties share a meal together, a powerful ritual of reconciliation in ancient cultures. Achilles grants an 11-day funeral truce and returns Hector's body, despite having vowed to never do so. This mirrors Jacob's insistence that Esau accept his gifts as a symbol of restored relationship. The chronology is critical here. These Homeric scenes were well established in Mediterranean literary culture centuries before the biblical Jacob-Esau story reached its final form during the post-exilic period. Biblical scholars have documented that the final redaction of Genesis likely occurred during the Hellenistic era, precisely when Greek cultural influence was at its height in the Near East. Dennis MacDonald, renowned for his analysis of biblical mimesis, argues that Jewish writers consciously adapted these emotionally powerful Greek reconciliation scenes, infusing them with their own theological message. The evidence suggests the biblical writers were deliberately engaging with Greek narrative traditions, creating what MacDonald calls a deliberate literary emulation. The borrowing doesn't end with Homer. Louden, Bruce Louden, has documented extensive structural parallels between the Jacob cycle and the Argonautic myth of Jason and the Golden Fleece. Both feature a hero who, with divine and female help, deceives a powerful relative and steals something precious, then flees. Both include a confrontation with the wronged party. The key difference is revealing. Where Jason never reconciles with King Aeetes and his story ends in tragedy, Jacob achieves reconciliation with Esau, leading to blessing. As Louden argues, the biblical author likely knew these Greek legends and intentionally crafted a more positive, redemptive ending in contrast to the bloodier Greek versions, effectively one-upping the Greek tradition with a more ethically satisfying conclusion. Even in Greek tragedy, we find templates for the biblical scene. In Sophocles' Electra, the reunion of brother Orestes and sister Electra features the joy of reconciliation, an emotional explosion of weeping and embracing on stage. As Jan Bremmer notes, Greek culture deeply valued the close bond between brother and sister in these reconciliation scenes. The biblical Jacob-Esau reunion follows this established dramatic pattern of emotional relief through family reunion. These aren't isolated resemblances, but systematic, detailed adaptations that demonstrate the biblical writers' sophisticated engagement with Greek literary traditions. The evidence shows they weren't merely creating original stories, but consciously reworking familiar narrative patterns from the dominant cultural heritage of their time. The evidence of biblical borrowing extends far beyond Greece and Mesopotamia. Egyptian mythology and folklore provide some of the oldest and most striking templates for the Jacob-Esau reconciliation. Stories that would have been well known to biblical writers during Israel's formative periods of Egyptian contact and influence. The cosmic struggle between Horus and Seth, documented in the Contendings of Horus and Seth from Egypt's 20th dynasty, that's around 1200 to 1085 BCE, presents a family power struggle with clear parallels. After Seth murders Osiris, Horus's father, the nephew and uncle engage in a protracted conflict over rightful succession to the throne, a divine version of the inheritance dispute between Jacob and Esau. Throughout their battles, we find a recurring pattern: attempted reconciliations orchestrated by divine authorities. At one critical juncture, the Council of Gods explicitly decrees that Horus and Seth should make peace and live amicably. The text records that they did reconcile and even shared a feast together, a ritual meal of brotherhood that precisely mirrors the reconciliation meal motif in Jacob and Esau's story. While Seth ultimately betrays this initial peace, the final resolution reveals a telling pattern. After 80 years of conflict, the gods impose a settlement. Horus receives the throne of Egypt, while Seth is granted a lesser domain. The division of inheritance and power directly parallels the biblical resolution where Jacob receives the covenant blessing, while Esau establishes his own territory in Seir. Even more compelling is the tale of two brothers from the New Kingdom era around 1200 BCE, predating Genesis by centuries. This narrative, preserved in the Papyrus di Urbini, follows two peasant brothers, Anpu and Bata, whose relationship fractures when Anpu's wife falsely accuses Bata of attempting seduction, a motif that appears again in the biblical Joseph story. Like Jacob, the younger brother Bata is forced to flee for his life, in a scene hauntingly similar to Jacob's crossing of the Jordan before meeting Esau. The gods create a river filled with crocodiles to separate the brothers, while Bata protests his innocence. The biblical parallel? Obvious. Jacob crosses the Jabbok River before confronting his brother, symbolically separating his old life from the new reconciliation. After extraordinary adventures including death and resurrection, Bata eventually rises to become pharaoh through divine favor, just as Jacob receives divine blessing and a new name, Israel. When the brothers finally reunite years later, there is no trace of an earlier hostility. Instead, Bata appoints his elder brother Anpu as crown prince, a gift of status that mirrors Jacob's gifts to Esau. The reconciliation is triggered by a divine sign, frothing beer that Bata had prophesied would signal trouble, functioning as a covenant token between the brothers. This parallels the divine orchestration of Jacob and Esau's reunion, where Jacob interprets his reconciliation with Esau as divinely sanctioned, telling his brother, "Seeing your face is like seeing the face of God." These Egyptian templates for reconciliation between feuding brothers existed centuries before the likely composition of Genesis. Israel's long historical connection with Egypt, from the Exodus traditions to Solomon's marriage alliance with Pharaoh, ensured that Egyptian literary motifs were well known to biblical writers. What makes these parallels so significant is not their antiquity, but their specificity. The pattern of conflict, flight, divine intervention, and ultimate reconciliation with exchanges of status or territory. The biblical writer's genius lay not in creating these narratives from nothing, but in adapting these well-established patterns to express their own message about divine providence and fraternal harmony. The reconciliation pattern we've traced through Mediterranean and Near Eastern mythologies extends remarkably into East Asia, revealing how deeply ingrained this narrative template is across human cultures. In Japan's ancient Shinto tradition, we find a sibling conflict with shocking parallels to biblical patterns. The storm god Susanoo, wild, impulsive, and destructive like Esau, violently disrupts the sacred weaving hall of his sister Amaterasu, the sun goddess. His transgressions are so severe that Amaterasu retreats into a cave, plunging the world into darkness, cosmic estrangement mirroring Jacob and Esau's separation. Like Jacob, who must transform himself through trials before meeting his wronged brother, Susanoo undergoes a period of exile and purification. During this exile, he performs a heroic feat, slaying the 8-headed dragon Arachi. From the monster's tail, he obtains the sacred Kusanagi sword. What happens next follows the exact reconciliation template we've seen in the Jacob story. Susanoo returns to heaven and offers this sword to Amaterasu as a reconciliation gift, a precise parallel to Jacob's elaborate gift of livestock to Esau. In both cases, the gift serves as a material token of contrition, a peace offering to restore harmony. Amaterasu's acceptance of the sword symbolizes her forgiveness, just as Esau's acceptance of Jacob's gifts sealed their reconciliation. This isn't mere coincidence. It's the same psychological and ritual pattern manifesting across cultures. The consequences of this divine reconciliation reverberate through Japanese tradition. The Kusanagi sword becomes one of the 3 imperial regalia of Japan, symbols of legitimate imperial rule. This parallels how Jacob and Esau's reconciliation legitimizes the distinct yet related kingdoms their descendants would establish. In both traditions, we see the same 3 elements: emotional recognition, Susanoo's implicit apology, Jacob's explicit one; symbolic gift-giving, the sacred sword, the livestock; and ritual confirmation, the formal presentation in the heavenly court, the elaborate meeting ceremony. The pattern continues in South Asian mythology. India's Mahabharata presents a sobering contrast. When the fraternal conflict between Pandavas and Kauravas fails to achieve reconciliation despite peace offerings, catastrophic war results. Through this negative example, the epic reinforces the same value system we see in Genesis. Reconciliation between brothers is sacred, and its failure brings disaster. In the Ramayana, we find the monkey kings Vali and Sugriva, brothers estranged by misunderstanding. Though their reconciliation comes tragically late, the dying Vali forgives Sugriva and entrusts his son Angada to his brother's care. This transfer of the next generation mirrors Jacob and Esau's concern for their descendants' future. What makes these Asian parallels so significant is that they emerged independently of Near Eastern influence, unlike the Mesopotamian, Egyptian, and Greek examples, which could have directly influenced biblical writers through cultural contact. The Asian stories developed in isolation. Now, some think there might have been some cross-contamination, but it would just be a general universal thing. They follow the same pattern, which suggests maybe deeper things at work, either a universal psychological template for resolving familial conflict, or perhaps evidence of ancient mythic patterns spreading across cultures even earlier than oftentimes is recognized. The biblical writers weren't creating in isolation, but participating in humanity's oldest narrative tradition. The story of how estranged family members find their way back to each other. Genesis presents not the first, but perhaps the most emotionally resonant version of this universal human hope, that even after bitter betrayal, reconciliation remains possible. What we've uncovered across these diverse mythologies is nothing less than a universal template for reconciliation, a psychological and ritual formula repeated with astonishing consistency across human cultures. And biblical writers didn't invent this pattern. They adopted it from a shared human inheritance. Anthropologists and comparative mythologists have identified 3 recurring elements in reconciliation narratives worldwide. The biblical Jacob-Esau story incorporates all three with remarkable precision. First, emotional breakthrough, what Bruce Louden calls recognition scenes or anagnorisis. This isn't merely sentimentality, but the essential psychological transformation that enables peace. Jacob and Esau fell on each other's necks and wept, a physical manifestation of their hearts softening toward each other. This emotional pivot appears in virtually every reconciliation myth. Gilgamesh and Enkidu kissed each other and became friends after their combat. Achilles, moved to compassion, weeps with Priam until the house was filled with the sound of weeping. The ancient texts describe this moment as a profound re-evaluation. Jacob suddenly sees Esau's face like the face of God, transforming his brother from enemy to divine reflection. Second, symbolic gift exchange, what anthropologist Marcel Mauss identified as the foundation of social bonds across cultures. Jacob's extravagant offering of livestock to Esau follows a pattern documented by folklorists worldwide, the appeasement gift that transforms enemies into allies. The scale of these gifts is revealing. Jacob sends hundreds of animals, a substantial portion of his wealth. Agamemnon offers Achilles 7 tripods, 10 talents of gold, 20 cauldrons, 12 horses, and more. Susanoo presents Amaterasu with a divine sword of immeasurable value. In each case, the magnitude of the gift correlates precisely with the severity of the breach, an unwritten social calculus the biblical writers clearly understood. Third, ritual confirmation, the formal public sealing of peace. While the Jacob-Esau meeting doesn't include an explicit oath, it's framed by Jacob's earlier covenant with Laban at Mitzvah, complete with stone heap, sacrificial feast, and divine invocation. The biblical writers were signaling their audience that this reconciliation followed established covenant patterns. Cross cultures, these rituals involve witnesses, shared meals, and divine sanction. Achilles and Agamemnon reconcile before the assembled Greek army. Achilles and Priam share a meal, invoking divine witnesses. Even in Japan, Susanoo's presentation of the sword to Amaterasu takes place in the heavens court, a ceremonial act with cosmic implications. These three elements form what comparative mythologists call an archetypal reconciliation script, a psychological and ritual sequence repeated across human cultures. Emotional recognition, the moment when enemies see each other as kin. Gift exchange, material compensation that rebalances the moral ledger. Ritual confirmation, public ceremony that secures the peace. This isn't random coincidence. As Jan Bremmer's research shows, these mythic patterns directly reflect actual reconciliation practices in ancient societies. From Hittite treaty ceremonies to Greek diplomatic protocols, Thomas Römer and others have suggested the Jacob-Esau story might even encode actual historical diplomacy between ancient Israel and Edom. The biblical writers weren't divine stenographers recording unique revelation. They were skilled cultural synthesizers, drawing on established narrative formulas that resonated across the ancient world. The Jacob-Esau reconciliation follows this universal template exactly, because its authors knew this was the most psychologically satisfying and culturally recognizable way to structure a reconciliation story. What makes the biblical version notable isn't its uniqueness, but its psychological depth. The vivid portrayal of internal transformation as brothers move from hatred to love. The biblical writers took a common narrative framework and infused it with profound emotional and theological significance. The evidence we've assembled forces us to confront startling conclusions that fundamentally challenge traditional religious understanding. Leading scholars across multiple disciplines have converged on a consensus that biblical writers weren't isolated vessels of divine revelation, but sophisticated cultural melders of ideas. Bruce Louden, in his groundbreaking comparative work, demonstrates that biblical and Greek authors existed in what he calls a dialogic relationship, consciously engaging with and responding to each other's literary traditions. The Jacob-Esau narrative shares specific motifs with the Greek Argonautica, a younger trickster aided by a female relative, theft of a blessing, flight, and confrontation with the wronged party. This isn't random coincidence. It's evidence of deliberate literary borrowing. Louden's research, described as the most expansive argument for Greek influence on the Hebrew Bible to date, reveals how biblical authors weren't creating in isolation, as we've noted. They're participating in a Mediterranean-wide conversation about conflict resolution. Even more revealing is Thomas Römer's historical critical scholarship, which has identified textual evidence that earlier versions of the Jacob-Esau story depicted perpetual conflict between the brothers. It was only later, during the post-exilic period, likely the Hellenistic era, that redactors softened the narrative to emphasize reconciliation. Why this radical revision? Römer argues the reconciliation story served a specific theological and political agenda, promoting peaceful relations between Jews and their Edomite Arab neighbors. The biblical command in Deuteronomy, "You shall not abhor an Edomite, for he is your brother," reveals how these myths functioned as political theology, using ancestral stories to shape contemporary relationships. Biblical scholars have systematically documented this pattern of borrowing. Dennis MacDonald's influential mimesis theory demonstrates how ancient authors deliberately modeled their narratives on famous older stories. Biblical writers weren't plagiarists, but creative adapters who would transform existing narratives to express their distinctive theology. What's particularly revealing is Jan Bremmer's observation that while Greek myth often ends tragically for siblings, like Eteocles and Polynices killing each other at Thebes, biblical narratives deliberately reshape these outcomes toward reconciliation. This represents a conscious theological choice, not historical reality. These narratives weren't just stories, but encoded actual reconciliation practices. Bremmer's research shows how Jacob and Esau's meal and embrace reflect real tribal reconciliation ceremonies. Similarly, Genesis 33:20 mentions Jacob erecting an altar after meeting Esau, likely representing an actual covenant ritual. Examining the full biblical canon reveals an unmistakable pattern, a progressive movement from the unredeemed fratricide of Cain and Abel, no reconciliation, to the partial reconciliation of Jacob and Esau. They make peace but separate, to the complete reconciliation of Joseph and his brothers who forgive and live together. This progression reflects an evolving ethical awareness, not historical accuracy. The consensus across academic disciplines, from literary comparativists like Louden and MacDonald to ritual scholars like Bremmer to historical critical scholars like Römer, presents us with three possibilities. First, that the biblical writers engaged in systematic literary borrowing from older mythic traditions, adapting them to express their own theological vision. The evidence for this? No doubt overwhelming. Second, these shared patterns emerged independently across cultures, reflecting universal psychological templates for resolving family conflict. However, the specific narrative details shared between biblical and other traditions make pure coincidence highly implausible. Third, the divine revelation somehow utilized pre-existing narrative patterns familiar to ancient audiences. This theological interpretation still requires acknowledging that biblical stories participate in a shared mythological heritage rather than appearing ex nihilo. The implications are profound. These stories aren't merely borrowed narratives but carry what scholars call profound symbolic weight, representing the healing of societal rifts, the triumph of mercy over justice, and the integration of opposing forces into a greater whole. As Jacob says upon reconciling with Esau, "God has dealt graciously with me." Grace emerges as the thread running through these reconciliation myths across cultures. The genius of biblical writers wasn't creating wholly original stories, but honestly transforming existing narrative patterns into vehicles for their distinctive ethical and theological vision. What these myths collectively teach us is that true reconciliation requires three elements that remain as relevant today as they were 3,000 years ago. First, emotional courage, the willingness to be vulnerable before one's enemy, When Jacob bows 7 times and Esau runs to embrace him, when Achilles weeps with Priam, when Gilgamesh and Enkidu kiss and become friends, these moments show that healing begins when we lower our defenses. As one analysis of Achilles and Priam puts it, the embrace of the 2 men leads to peace. An act of forgiveness heals the heart of true heroism. Across cultures, reconciliation begins not with strategic calculation, but with emotional openness. Second, material restitution, the tangible acknowledgement of wrongs through gifts or compensation. Jacob's lavish gift of livestock, Susanu's offering of the sacred sword, Agamemnon's treasure to Achilles, all recognize that words alone cannot heal deep wounds. Reconciliation requires concrete action that demonstrates sincerity and restores balance. Third, communal witness, the transformation of private forgiveness into public peace. Whether through shared meals, formal treaties, or ceremonial embraces, genuine reconciliation is sealed in the presence of witnesses. It becomes not just a personal moment, but a restoration of social and cosmic order. These ancient stories speak directly to our most pressing contemporary challenges. From family estrangements to tribal conflicts to international wars, we continue to face the same fundamental question that troubled our ancestors. Can enemies become brothers again? The mythic answer, repeated across cultures, is resoundingly affirmative. Yes, through courage, remorse, and graciousness. The variations in these reconciliation stories reflect the complex realities as we still face them. Sometimes reconciliation is mutual and heartfelt, sometimes one-sided or externally imposed, yet the aspiration itself matters. When Jacob tells Esau, "Seeing your face is like seeing the face of God," he expresses a profound truth that transcends religious boundaries. In the face of the former enemy, now reconciled, we glimpse something divine. This transformation from seeing the other as threat to seeing them as sacred represents the highest form of human wisdom. In a world still torn by bitter conflicts, these ancient myths offer not just comfort but practical advice. They remind us that heroism lies not in victory through strength, but in the courage to forgive and the wisdom to restore broken relationships. They show us that even after the deepest betrayals, reconciliation remains possible. The enduring power of these stories suggests they express something fundamental about human nature, not just who we have been, but who we aspire to be. Across time and cultures, they reflect our deepest hope that the cycle of vengeance can be broken, that estrangement can give way to reunion, that fear and anger can transform into love and peace. This mythic wisdom, documented across civilizations from the earliest written records, continues to illuminate our path forward. It invites each of us to reenact these ancient embraces in our own lives, to find the courage to bow before those we've wronged, to run toward those who have hurt us, and to discover, in the face of our former enemy, the sacred reflection of our shared humanity. I hope you've enjoyed this. Again, another mythic story from the Bible by MythVision. Like the video. What's your favorite part about this video? Let me know in the comments section. If there's any other myths that you know that share a similar type of theme, share them as well. Comment, share it, join the Patreon. We could really use your support. We're interviewing academics in person and getting one question per Patreon supporter, per academic that I'll be interviewing in person. And I plan on doing many, many more. We could use your help. This is the backbone. Patreon, the support of being a member on MythVision's YouTube, and also buying the courses at mvp-courses.com. Own them for life. They're academic courses. They're high quality. We could use your support and also take your education to the next level. Thanks so much.